This is a brief lecture on food webs and chemical cycles. Trophic levels are energy levels or nourishment levels. You've probably heard of these before, but maybe not referred to it as that term of trophic level. Trophic levels are as follows. The primary producers are the level that supports all of the others. They're also called autotrophs. The reason they are called producers is because they produce their own food. These are plants. These are all of the organisms that use photosynthesis to create their own food. The primary consumers are those that eat the primary producers. So that means these are all of the herbivores in an area. Secondary consumers are those that eat the primary consumers. These can be either carnivores or omnivores. Secondary consumers eat primary consumers, and sometimes secondary consumers can also eat producers, making them an omnivore. Tertiary consumers are those that eat secondary consumers. So a tertiary consumer can also be an omnivore or a carnivore, depending on the species. Both carnivores and omnivores can fall into secondary or tertiary consumers, and organisms can move between trophic levels depending on the particular food chain. So one organism is not always stuck in one of those levels. Let's take a look at this food web here. So a food web is a lot of food chains that are combined together, and a food chain is just one linear sequence of who eats who. Notice the direction the arrows are pointing. They're pointing in the direction of energy flow, from where the energy comes from to what's getting the energy. So the leaves get energy from the sun, and then the slug eats those leaves, so it gets the energy from those. The frog then eats the slug, and then the heron eats the frog. Over here, we see a lot of different food webs that are being combined together. Sometimes an organism will fall into a secondary consumer here, right? So it's a phytoplankton would be the producers, and then herbivorous plankton would be the primary consumers. Then a squid would be a secondary consumer. But if we follow this path, phytoplankton, herbivorous plankton, carnivorous plankton to the squid, now the squid is a secondary consumer, or I'm sorry, a tertiary consumer. So this is the producers, primary, secondary, tertiary. So oftentimes organisms can move between different levels depending on the particular food chain that they are in. Other types of trophic levels are called detritivores or decomposers. Both of these are heterotrophs that feed on dead organic matter. Detritivores, also called detritus feeders, could be called scavengers. These are larger, so we also regulate them on the energy pyramid, and they are secondary consumers, typically, because of their size, they will be detritivores. Decomposers are much smaller. These do not get regulated on the energy pyramid because they're very, very small. This is things like bacteria and maggots and small things, fungi that break down the material so they can be reused by plants. Here's some examples here. We have some decomposers like the bacteria and the fungi, and some detritivores like vultures and coyotes. Here's some relationships that you need to know about. Obviously, the food chain and the food web show how those organisms are all related to one another, and then the trophic structure is just the feeding relationships or nourishment levels. So keep in mind that energy flows from the producers to the primary consumers to the secondary consumers, but when that energy is transferred, a very small amount of the energy actually gets transferred. Only 10% of the energy gets moved from one level to the next, and that's called the 10% law. We have 3 diagrams that illustrate this. So here is an energy or productivity diagram here. This shows the amount of retained and available energy. So if the producers have 10,000 joules of energy, joule is just a measurement of energy like calories, then the primary consumers can only retain 1,000 of those joules. 10% is transferred, but 90% is lost to the environment as heat, or as typically as heat, or for the metabolic purposes of that organism. So if then the primary consumers have 1,000 joules of energy, the secondary consumers can only retain 100 joules, and the tertiary only 10, which is why we see so many fewer tertiary consumers in an ecosystem than primary consumers or plants. Biomass is the same way. Biomass just shows the actual weight of what each trophic level contains. So there's a larger mass of the producers, and then as you go up the pyramid, it decreases again by that 90% is lost and only 10% is retained. Pyramid of numbers works the same way. There's the largest number of producers, and then herbivores are the second largest group, then the secondary consumers are third largest, and the top carnivores or the tertiary consumers are the smallest groups. They have the least number of members. All right, we're also going to do some chemical cycling, and chemical cycles, we're going to do 3 different ones. Biochemical cycles are how various nutrients go through both abiotic and biotic components of the ecosystem. We're going to do water, carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus is in parentheses because we're not going to focus on that, but you might see it arise in somewhere else, and so know that that's also a chemical cycle involved in biology. Hopefully you've already seen the water cycle previously. The water cycle has important components like condensation, precipitation, runoff, evaporation. Those are probably words that you already know. Some words that might be new to you are percolation. That's how the water filters down through the soil to get into the groundwater. Or evapotranspiration. Transpiration is water evaporating out of the plant leaves and into the air. The second is our carbon cycle. So carbon cycle focuses primarily on photosynthesis and cellular respiration. Photosynthesis is how plants take carbon dioxide from the air and convert it into sugars, which the animals eat. Then they do cellular respiration, which releases carbon dioxide into the air. Plants also do cellular respiration, and that's also how decomposers and detritivores decompose their food, so that puts carbon dioxide in. Notice that trees, or plants in general, are the only way that carbon dioxide is getting out of the air. Additionally, humans burn wood and fossil fuels, which puts excess carbon dioxide into the air. Our third cycle is nitrogen, and this is the most complicated because it's all new to you. So nitrogen starts off in the atmosphere, and that is in the form of N2. There is a ton of nitrogen in our atmosphere. Almost 80% of the atmosphere is made up of nitrogen, but unfortunately we can't use any of that nitrogen. In order to use it, the nitrogen-fixing bacteria must fix it into a usable form, such as ammonia, or nitrates, or nitrites. These are all usable forms that can be assimilated or brought into plants. Then when those plants die and decompose, they get turned back into ammonium. So, in order for plants to use them, and therefore for animals to eat the plants to get the nitrogen, it has to go through nitrogen fixation. Sometimes the nitrites will also be denitrified and released back into the air. Let's take a look at some of these vocabulary words so you can make sure to know these words. Nitrogen in the atmosphere is in a gaseous form of N2. It has to be transformed into a usable form for organisms. Because N2 is not usable, we need it in a usable form. So nitrogen-fixing bacteria are the organisms that do that. They take the N2 and convert it into NH4. That's called nitrogen fixation. NH4 is also produced by decomposers. When they break down organic material, then that turns it into ammonia, and that's called ammonification. There's also different bacteria that take the ammonia, NH4, and convert it into nitrite and nitrate. That process is called nitrification, and that is what allows plants to assimilate that nitrogen into their cells. Then animals eat that and can also be decomposed back into ammonia. Denitrifying bacteria will convert the nitrate, which is the NO3, back into N2 for release back into the atmosphere. So let's take a look at this again. In the atmosphere, nitrogen-fixing bacteria turn the nitrogen into ammonium. Then nitrifying bacteria do nitrification to turn it into NO3. This is the type of nitrogen that plants need, and it is assimilated into the plant cells through assimilation. Then those plants get eaten by animals, and both plants and animals will eventually decompose back into ammonia, which can then go through nitrification back into NO3 to be assimilated by some other plant. Sometimes nitrates are also denitrified back into nitrogen atmospheric nitrogen of N2. Right. And that is all for today, so please complete your assignments and contact Ms. Jewett if you have any questions. Thank you.